So when you first imagined reading aloud to your kids, did you think that you would all be snuggled up on the couch, your kids listening intently as you read? And then you gave it a try. And if your kids are anything like mine, it probably didn't quite work out the way you imagined. Hi, I'm Christy with Homeschooling in Progress, and I'm going to share with you some things that your kids can do while you read aloud to keep their hands busy and their minds focused on what you're reading. Now, many homeschooling families have found a secret to getting your kids to listen during read-alouds, myself included, and that is to read aloud while your kids are eating. It's hard to be doing something else or talk when your mouths are full of food. So, breakfast and lunch are some times that a lot of families do their read aloud time. Now, I personally like to eat during breakfast and lunch, so that doesn't quite work out for us. But instead, I have found that letting my kids get a snack right before we do read alouds works perfectly. And we like to do our read alouds at the end of our morning basket, which we call a morning meeting. And I have a video about that. Actually, I have a whole series about that. You can find them up above and check them out and then come back to what your kids can do while you read aloud. And so, like I said, I let my kids, we take a little break and I let my kids go and get a snack that'll keep them busy while I do my read aloud. And then as they eat, I do our read aloud. It works really well for us. Now, sometimes, I might read a couple of chapters or I might have more reading aloud than just a snack time will allow. And so I have to have some other things on hand to keep them busy because I have very active children. And if I don't keep them busy with something, then they end up talking while I'm trying to read, or they end up wrestling on the floor, or, any of the things that kids can do when they're supposed to be sitting and listening. And so I have tried lots of different things for my kids to do while I do read alouds. One thing that my boys really enjoy doing when they're not eating, the next favorite thing they like to do is drawing or coloring. They like to illustrate what I'm reading, or sometimes they'll just make some pictures of their own. In fact, they're starting to kind of try to create their own books. And so they'll use the time that I'm doing read alouds to illustrate their books. So that's a great activity that, it keeps their hands busy, but their minds are focused and they're quiet. Coloring is also another thing. They can color on blank paper, or you could have some coloring books ready. Just, something to keep their hands busy while you're reading. Another thing that can keep their hands busy are puzzles or quiet games. Perhaps your kids can do solitaire while you're reading, or my 3-year-old likes to work on those little chunky Melissa and Doug puzzles. And so he can work on that while I'm reading. If you have room, then your kids could work on a larger puzzle while you do read alouds. And that definitely is something that's going to keep them quiet while you're reading. Sticker books are another great activity. It's something, again, that's very quiet, but they're able to use their hands. I've found that when their hands are busy, their minds are focused. And so sticker books are great for that. Stamp pads and ink and just plain pieces of paper. That keeps my 3-year-old occupied. It keeps my older kids occupied. And then also sensory items are a great thing to do when you're reading aloud. If you have some Play-Doh out, you could just give your kids some Play-Doh. You can set up little kits that have some different things that they can put in the Play-Doh. They can have rollers or cookie cutters, things like that, to keep them occupied while you're reading. Or if your kids can be quiet with it, Legos are also something that's good for them to do while you're reading. Obviously, you don't want them rustling through the Legos while you're trying to read because that is very distracting. We've tried that. But instead, if you just have them maybe grab a handful of Legos and have them next to them, then they can sort through just those while you're reading. And that should be a lot quieter. And then handwork. Especially if you follow a Charlotte Mason approach, you probably do a little bit of handwork with your kids. And so if they already know how to do some of it, obviously reading aloud, you're a little occupied and can't really teach them how to do it. But if they've already had a little bit of introduction, they can use read aloud time as the perfect time to practice their skills. And so if they're learning how to embroider, they can practice their stitches, or they can work on a new embroidery piece. If they're learning how to knit or crochet, they could do finger knitting too. So, those are all things that will keep them quiet, but focused on what you're doing, and, keep their hands busy so they're less likely to have their minds wander and then end up wrestling on the floor. And if you try a lot of those things and you're still finding, this just still isn't working, why are my kids being so crazy when I'm trying to read aloud? Well, I have some tips of some things that might be going on that maybe you can also give a try and see if, alleviating some of these things will help with your read aloud focus. One of the tips is to make sure your reading time is not too long. Especially little kids, 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, they do not have very long attention spans. So if you're trying to do, a half-hour read aloud, it might just be too long. They just can't sit that long and focus. And so maybe shorten that. If you're reading a couple of books, maybe just, read one. If it's a short one, maybe 1 or 2. If you're doing a chapter book, maybe you just read a chapter. And so try shortening that time and see if that helps with your read aloud focus. Another thing that might be a problem is maybe the pace that you're reading at is too fast or too slow. If your pace is too fast, then they may not be catching what you're reading, and so they're kind of missing what's going on, which, that can get boring, and so, okay, well, I'm just going to wrestle on the floor then. Or if you're reading too slow, their mind, may be like, okay, I'm all caught up with what you're saying, let's move it along, or I'm just going to kind of move on to my own thing. So, try to work on your pace of how you're reading. Make sure you're not reading too slow or too quickly. And then, maybe they just don't like the book. There have been some books that we've done, luckily not too many, but there have been some books in our read alouds none of us could really get into. Or maybe they just weren't ready for that book yet. And so, if you're a few chapters, give it a few chapters. But if you're a few chapters into a book and it just doesn't seem like any of you are really getting into it, it's okay to put it back on the shelf for a while. Maybe you'll be able to go back to it another time. Maybe it's just not a very good book to do as a read aloud. Some books are better to read on your own than to do as a read aloud. So maybe it's something the kids just read on their own time. But it's okay to put a book back. You don't have to finish every single book you start. So, pick something else. If it's a book that doesn't have a lot of action, maybe your kids want a lot of action. If it's a book that just has maybe too much action, maybe slow it down and pick something that's a little different. Maybe if you're used to reading chapter books, maybe try some picture books for a while. There are, even for older kids, even upper elementary, they like reading picture books and having picture books read to them. And there are some picture books that have so much information to them, and the illustrations are just so gorgeous that it does hold the older kids' attention. And so picture books aren't just for 3, 4, or 5-year-olds. So vary your books also. So, give some of those tips a try. Put some food in front of them or something to keep their hands busy. But just try some different things with your kids, because read aloud time is definitely worth it. The benefits of the language development and the reading comprehension skills, and there are so many benefits to reading aloud, not to mention the relationship and the bond that it creates with you and your children. You want those memories. You want them to have that special time with you. So, try to find some things that you can do to keep their hands busy and their minds focused while you do your read aloud time. So it's an enjoyable experience for everybody. So I hope those tips help you. Thank you for watching. Happy homeschooling.